Cleopatra is one of the best attested rulers of the late Hellenistic Mediterranean in political terms. Yet the most basic biographical question about her remains unusually resistant to proof. What were her biological origins? The obstacle is not a lack of interest or even a lack of surviving material culture. It is the absence of the one artifact modern genetics would require: her body. Ancient writers reported that Cleopatra was buried after her death in 30 BCE. Later generations assumed that her tomb lay somewhere within the royal district of Alexandria, close to the palace complex where the Ptolemies ruled for nearly 3 centuries. But no archaeologically confirmed mausoleum has ever been found. Much of Alexandria's ancient waterfront has long since disappeared beneath the Mediterranean due to earthquakes, subsidence, and gradual coastal change. That absence matters because DNA evidence is not something that can be extracted from reputation or biography. It is a property of specific physical remains. Researchers require bone, teeth, or preserved tissue from which genetic material can be retrieved. Without those remains, claims about ancestry cannot be direct in the way modern audiences often imagine. Instead, they become indirect. They are built from family trees, population comparisons, and assumptions about the identities of skeletons discovered elsewhere. That gap has shaped the debate for decades. Some archaeologists believe Cleopatra's tomb may yet be discovered outside the submerged royal quarter. Excavations at a site west of Alexandria, known as Taposiris Magna, have attracted particular attention. Coins bearing Cleopatra's image and late Ptolemaic artifacts have been found there, encouraging speculation that the queen may have been buried in the temple complex. Other scholars remain cautious. Coins and pottery prove that the site was active during Cleopatra's lifetime, but they do not prove that the queen herself was buried there until a tomb with clear inscriptions or royal regalia is uncovered. The theory remains speculative, and that disagreement matters more than it might seem. Without a confirmed tomb, there is no confirmed body. Without a body, there can be no direct genetic test. The part of Cleopatra's ancestry that is secure is dynastic rather than biological. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal house that ruled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his generals divided his empire among themselves. One of them, Ptolemy son of Lagus, took control of Egypt and eventually crowned himself king. Ptolemy I Soter was Macedonian. His family, language, and court culture were Greek. His descendants ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years while maintaining their identity as a Hellenistic royal house. In many ways, the dynasty remained culturally separate from the country it governed. Greek was the language of administration and court life. The Ptolemies frequently married within their own family in order to preserve dynastic legitimacy. Brother married sister in several generations, a practice that imitated the traditions of Egyptian pharaohs while simultaneously limiting the number of outsiders entering the royal bloodline. On paper, then, Cleopatra belonged to a Macedonian Greek dynasty ruling Egypt. But the moment historians attempt to translate that dynastic identity into biological ancestry, the record begins to blur. Cleopatra's father is known with certainty. He was Ptolemy XII Auletes, a controversial king who relied heavily on Roman support to maintain his throne. Ancient writers describe him as politically weak and financially dependent on Roman creditors, but his position within the royal family is well documented. The uncertainty begins with Cleopatra's mother. Ancient sources do not clearly identify her. Many historians believe she was Cleopatra V Tryphena, a queen who appears briefly in the historical record, before disappearing from it. But the evidence is circumstantial. Names repeat frequently in the later Ptolemaic dynasty, and royal women often shared titles or co-ruled with their husbands and daughters. As a result, the family tree becomes unusually difficult to reconstruct. Some scholars argue that Cleopatra V died early and could not have been the mother of all the children attributed to her. Others believe she remained alive longer than the surviving sources suggest. Modern reference works often describe Cleopatra V as the likely mother, but they also acknowledge that the evidence is incomplete. That uncertainty becomes even more complicated when Cleopatra's grandmother is considered. Several ancient sources describe Ptolemy XII himself as illegitimate. If that description is accurate, it means that his own mother may not have been a formally recognized queen of the dynasty. Her identity is not clearly recorded in surviving texts. A single unknown mother in the family, Tree is enough to complicate any attempt to trace biological ancestry with confidence. Dynasties record political legitimacy carefully. They are often far less precise about the women who fall outside official titles. This creates a strange historical paradox. Cleopatra's political lineage is well documented. She was unquestionably the daughter of a ruling king in a long-established royal house. Yet the biological ancestry that modern audiences are most curious about depends precisely on the women whose identities remain uncertain. That uncertainty eventually produced a range of competing interpretations. Some historians emphasize the dynasty's Macedonian Greek origins and argued that Cleopatra was overwhelmingly descended from Greek ancestors. The Ptolemies had repeatedly married within their own family for generations, making the line relatively closed. Others pointed out that royal families are rarely as genetically isolated as official genealogies suggest. Political alliances, concubinage, and unofficial relationships often introduce new ancestry that never appears in formal records. In the absence of clear evidence, both interpretations remained plausible. For centuries, the debate remained largely academic. It was conducted through textual analysis, coin portraits, and the interpretation of ancient writers. Then, in the early 21st century, genetics seemed to offer a new kind of answer. The opportunity did not come from Cleopatra herself. Her remains were still missing. Instead, it appeared to come from a different figure in her family, her younger sister, Arsinoe IV. Ancient historians recorded that Arsinoe was captured by Roman forces during the civil war between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. She was later exiled to the city of Ephesus in modern Turkey, where she was eventually executed on the orders of Mark Antony. In the 20th century, archaeologists studying Ephesus identified an unusual tomb known as the Octagon. Because of its date and prominent location, some researchers suggested that the burial might belong to Arsinoe. In 2009, the theory reached a wider audience through a television documentary that combined archaeology with forensic reconstruction. The program argued that the skeletal remains from the Octagon might provide clues about Arsinoe's ancestry, and therefore indirectly about Cleopatra's. A reconstruction of the skull suggested facial features that the documentary interpreted as evidence of mixed heritage. Headlines soon translated that interpretation into a much stronger claim that Cleopatra herself may have had African ancestry through her maternal line. It was an intriguing possibility, but even at the time, specialists urged caution. The identification of the skeleton as Arsinoe was not certain. No inscription in the tomb named the occupant. The skeletal remains themselves were incomplete and had been removed decades earlier during earlier excavations. More importantly, attempts to extract ancient DNA from the bones had largely failed. Without usable genetic material, the forensic conclusions rested mainly on skull measurements and visual reconstruction. Even if the skeleton had been definitively identified as Arsinoe, another complication remained. Cleopatra and Arsinoe may not have shared the same mother. In the tangled genealogy of the late Ptolemaic dynasty, half-siblings were common. That meant that any biological information about Arsinoe's maternal ancestry could not automatically be applied to Cleopatra. For several years, the theory continued to circulate in popular discussions despite those caveats. Then a new study changed the situation entirely. In 2025, an international research team applied modern genetic and morphological analysis to the remains from the Octagon tomb. The results overturned the earlier assumptions. The skeleton did not belong to a young woman at all. It belonged to a boy between 11 and 14 years old. Genetic analysis suggested ancestry consistent with populations from the Italian peninsula or Sardinia, not with the royal family of Ptolemaic Egypt. On genetic grounds alone, the researchers concluded that the remains could not belong to Arsinoe. In other words, the one set of bones that had been repeatedly used to speculate about Cleopatra's ancestry did not belong to her sister at all. The supposed genetic pathway into Cleopatra's family simply disappeared. From a scientific perspective, this outcome was not unusual. Archaeology frequently reinterprets earlier identifications when new techniques become available, but the implications were significant. The debate about Cleopatra's biological origins returned almost immediately to where it had started, a combination of incomplete family records and missing physical evidence. Modern genetics can still say something about the wider population history of Egypt. Studies of ancient mummies have shown that populations in the Nile Valley were connected to the Near East the Mediterranean, and Africa through long-standing migration and trade networks. But those studies describe populations, not individuals. Cleopatra herself belonged to a foreign-origin dynasty that ruled Egypt for centuries while maintaining a Greek-speaking court and a carefully managed royal lineage. Without her remains, or those of a securely identified close relative, genetics cannot assign her to any specific mixture of ancestries. Even archaeology cannot yet resolve the question. If Cleopatra's tomb were discovered tomorrow, identification would still require a chain of evidence: inscriptions, dating, historical context, and ideally genetic comparison with another known member of the dynasty. Until then, the scientific record remains incomplete. The irony is that the most important genetic discovery connected to Cleopatra in recent years did not reveal anything about her ancestry at all. Instead, it demonstrated how easily a compelling story can form around uncertain evidence. DNA did not confirm a hidden heritage or overturn the dynasty's recorded origins. It simply showed that the skeleton used to support those claims belonged to someone else entirely. In the end, Cleopatra remains what she has always been: a figure whose political life is vividly documented, but whose biological origins remain partly obscured by the gaps of ancient history. Science has not solved that mystery. If anything, it has clarified why the mystery persists. Sometimes the past resists final answers not because the evidence is hidden, but because it no longer exists.